Let me read to you a passage from the 7th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 6 and then verses 12 to 14. It's the Gospel for Tuesday of the 12th week in Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, and then turn and tear you to pieces. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." That's from Matthew chapter 7, verses 6 and then verses 12 to 14. What does it suggest to us? Well, of course, it speaks of the narrow gate. What do we mean? Well, let me speak of an event that occurred in the Second World War. It occurred in a notorious German concentration camp, as I said, during the Second World War. The penalty was that some of the prisoners were to be executed. The German officer went through the lines of prisoners, picking at random those who were to suffer the ultimate sanction as a reprisal. Just as one was selected, that person broke down in despair, calling out that his death would leave his wife and children without him. Undoubtedly, he had longingly thought of them during his incarceration, perhaps taking great care to avoid all unnecessary risks. And now all that had gone, and he was to go to his death through no fault of his own, and he was inconsolable. It was the greatest crisis in his life, and it was beyond him. Then suddenly, and ever so quietly, a man stepped forward from the ranks of those who had missed the deadly selection. He went to the officer and asked to replace the man who had virtually collapsed with grief. "Let him go, and I shall take his place." "Who are you?" "I am the Catholic priest here," he replied. The officer paused. "All right." And turning to the grief-stricken husband and father, he said, "You may return." The priest took his place beside the condemned men and spent the rest of his short time, the short time remaining to him, in sustaining them spiritually as they all went to their terrible deaths. That man was Saint Maximilian Kolbe. A unique moment had arisen. It called for heroism, a passing through an especially difficult and narrow door. And in that instant, he made the supreme choice. How was it possible? No one would have thought the lesser of him had he not done this. Well, to understand it, one must think of his history of similar choices during the course of his life prior to this special moment. He had been passing through the narrow door, the narrow gate, for a long time. That is to say, he had been living a life of high virtue, day by day, choosing the path of greater generosity to God and man. And when the moment came, he passed through the narrow gate once again, and that narrow gate led to his glory. In our Gospel today that I read earlier, our Lord asks us to enter not by the broad gate, but by the narrow one. Let our minds pass to another crisis moment, portrayed in the Gospel this time. It occurred in the palace of Herod the Tetrarch, the administrator of Galilee and son of Herod the Great. He threw a great feast on his birthday, and the leading figures of Galilee were in attendance. They were men and women of the world, and we must assume far from God. The daughter of Herodias entered and danced in spectacular fashion. It was something of a sensation, and Herod, seized by the moment and with liquor doing its work, called out that she was magnificent. "Whatever you ask," he bawled, "I will give you." He was flaunting his machismo liking for what pleased men. In 2 or 3 moments he had his answer. She wanted the head of John the Baptist. It was a crisis moment. There was but a moment allowed, just as there was but a moment allowed for Colby. Colby passed through the narrow gate, while Herod long before passed through the very broad gate. It was the gate of least resistance to temptation, the temptation of human respect and of conforming to the perceived expectations of the world before him. Colby took the path that led to life, Herod Antipas the path that led to destruction. As we heard our Lord say, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." On other occasions our Lord warned his hearers to be on the watch always, for no one knows the day or the hour of his coming. This is commonly taken to refer to the coming of our Lord at the end of time or at the end of our lives, but it also refers to any of his comings. Christ comes to us in the events of our lives. Indeed, he comes to us in every single duty that is before us. Cardinal Newman, in a famous publication, his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, described the conscience as the aboriginal vicar of Christ. In every moment of duty, Christ is summoning us to obey and to follow him. In other words, to pass through the narrow gate, not the broad one. The key to taking the narrow gate, whenever it may appear before us, is to endeavour to take that gate always. Every day we ought rise from bed with the intention of passing through the narrow gate during the day before us. That is to say, we ought resolve to keep close to Christ, to imitate him, to follow in his footsteps in all the duties that lie before us. When the crunch time comes, and come it will, most especially at the moment of death, then we shall be ready to pass through the narrow gate once more. The time will come when, for the last time, 2 gates rise before us. One will be broad of entry, the other narrow. The one will lead to destruction, the other to life. Well, let us by our whole life be preparing for that final passage.